So, welcome to Season Desist podcast. Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I'm really excited to dig into this
Yeah,
today.
thank you for having me. Happy to do it.
So, we were just talking a moment ago about the fact that we have this very wide asset recovery ecosystem, and many people will not simply be aware of just the amount of organizations that play a sort of critical role in the asset recovery lifecycle. I think most listeners and most people will know of the traditional compliance role and intelligence, and then there's the investigative part with law enforcement, and then there's the asset seizure part, for example, to give a very simple version. But I doubt many will understand the sheer scale. And I know that coming from the UK, I'm aware of like public and private sector partnerships. I'm aware of NGOs and the role they've played in the sidelines. But you and I spoke, a couple of weeks back, and it was the first time I'd learned about sort of TRAC and what you guys were doing, and particularly in your region. And I just found it absolutely sort of fascinating, the scale at which you were operating. So I'd love to hear that about what is TRAC, the mission, what it's up to, and ultimately and how you got into this particular role to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah. So TRAC was started back in 2014, primarily as a result of your traditional brick and mortar money laundering service businesses that people around the world know or use, like Western Union, MoneyGram, RIA. There was a case in the state of Arizona where Western Union and the state of Arizona ended up going after Western Union because they were allowing their systems to be utilized for the movement of human smuggling funds. So there was a back and forth investigation that went on in a case that ultimately was settled in 2010. And then it ended up in an amended settlement agreement in 2014 when the state wasn't happy with how Western Union was proceeding with implementing anti-money laundering, policies and rules and processes, getting them in place. They weren't satisfied at the speed in which they were doing that. And what came out of that, among a number of other things, was TRAC. And TRAC it's an organization where, at the time, Western Union was obligated to provide all of their transactional data to the state of Arizona.
Like, what was there a monetary de minimis
There
on that, or was
was,
it
and
just
it
everything?
moved back and forth because they weren't sure exactly what the right amount was, but ultimately they settled on $500. And the reason being is any transaction. So average family maintenance remittance to this day is below $400. It's in the high $300. So somebody moves up here to the US to work, or comes here from Mexico or Honduras or wherever it might be, and they're sending money back to their family. That's typically below $400. So
Because the nature of the labor that they're involved in as
right.
well is not going to be paying, a couple of $1,000s a
Right.
week.
It's different than money. Whereas if you were to look at money leaving the US going to China or India, it's a much higher dollar value. But
Yeah.
because we're, situated in the southwest border at the time, that's all that we were focused on. That was the dollar amount that was settled on. And the reason being is law enforcement isn't, the state's not interested in looking at those transfers, that are considered legitimate, licit funds, not illicit funds. So, that was kind of how it started. And among the other things that came out of that, in addition to Western Union having to provide that data to the state said, we're going to make this data available to law enforcement along the southwest border and stand up anti-money laundering units along the southwest border, which Western Union had to fund. There was a settlement agreement of about $93 million that they had to provide the state.
What a good use of that, rather than just, I mean, I've complained ad nauseum about financial institutions and crypto exchanges getting these big regulatory
Yes.
fines, but like what really happens? Because it's for them, if you're making billions, paying a couple of million in fines certainly doesn't help hurt your reputation, because they don't seem to miss a beat after that. Like that's. Do you know, has that been a normal thing in the US? Those types of programs being funded, or was this a sort of a relatively new
No,
initiative?
we're the only one in the U.S. that does this. There's no other
Wow.
program in the country like TRAC. Um, they had a very, at the time, the prosecutor that handled the case for the state of Arizona had a ton of foresight. He was really kind of visionary. And he's since passed away, but he was known throughout the U.S. as, being one of the anti-money laundering gurus across the United States. And if it weren't for him, he's the one that really stood this program up. And he was a director of the program for the first couple of years, and then he got sick and passed away. But um, it was started off as a Southwest border program that, all law enforcement had access to Western Union data. And then another thing that came out of that settlement agreement was the agreement by the state that they would pursue the same data footprint that they were getting from Western Union from all of the other MSBs that are operating in the Southwest border.
Yeah, because otherwise criminals will just move to the one that's not
Right.
being feeding data.
Right.
Yeah.
And the state of Arizona has a very unique, it's a racketeering demand letter request called a request to produce. It's a subpoena. They have subpoena authority, administrative subpoena authority, where they can issue these subpoenas to these different money service businesses, and they will comply and provide the data to the state. So that's how it started in 2014. And of course, it was a tool that was for free for law enforcement because it's there's no licensing required that they're going to have to pay because the whole thing was funded by Western Union. So
I know that it's maybe a boring admin point, but I find it fascinating. Is that like in perpetuity? Was it for 10 years, 20 years? Like what was the
it
actual,
was,
like the terms of it, if
yeah,
you
it
know
was
it?
good for 5 years. The funding lasted five
Yeah.
years, but
And then the state sees the ROI and decides, well, like this is something we definitely want to keep
so
funding.
fast forward 5 years,
Yeah.
the federal government had now started using TRAC. Um, and what initially started off as a program that was just thought to be was going to be a Southwest border program. So that, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, the four Southwest border states, everybody thought it was just going to be a program that was utilized by law enforcement in that area. But what we soon realized was that, money laundering isn't isolated to the Southwest border. And, drug trafficking, especially with the Mexican drug cartels, it's going all over the United States, and there's all other sorts of crime. And, law enforcement got smarter as a result of doing analysis of the data that we had in the repository. Um, so, around 2019, the federal government, I was in place at the time. So I came over to TRAC in 2016, 2017, right after I retired from the police department. I spent 20 something years as a cop in Connecticut and Arizona. So I went to TRAC, and obviously the value of the program was growing. Um, I knew we needed to have a funding source to take care of it. So spoke to our federal partners, and they said, "Yeah, there's you guys have become too valuable for us. We can't."
I was just going to say, obviously, invaluable
Yeah.
intelligence.
So, since that time, we've been funded by the federal government. Um, but we also are, as people start using more data. The data was at first was isolated to just the southwest border in Mexico. So anywhere money moved to and from around the world from the southwest border, if it touched one of the southwest border states, we had the data. And then if it went to
Mhm.
Mexico, we had the data. Well, the data footprint eventually expanded, as we saw, the huge growth in fentanyl use here in the U.S. and the investigative need was very obvious around the U.S. So now we have, data from all of the United States to Mexico, and Mexico back.
And for those that don't understand, or those outside the US, do you have the data? You have the data of what's being transmitted from the US to Mexico. Is it because of Western Union? Is it their Mexican office? Do you get the same data on the other side? Do you identify individuals on the other side, or is that collected
Right,
sort of
right.
stateside?
So we get both the sender of proceeds and the receiver. And yeah, and then like I said, from the southwest border states, it's to and from anywhere in the world, except for countries that fall under GDPR. So if there's a country that falls under GDPR, we don't get that data. And that's honestly that's really not of a money laundering concern here in the southwest border. Um,
Yeah.
but so TRAC was started as a result of a human smuggling investigation, but now we see it has all sorts of other applicability. Human smuggling, human trafficking, obviously drug trafficking still to this day is our biggest use case. Um, there is a ton of fraud being, the romance scams where money or the Nigerian scams where there's money leaving the U.S. going to Africa. Um, but what has happened, is so here we are, 2019, 2020, and we're starting to see a little bit of a fall off in the system with the typical fraud. Um, and then crypto's growing and growing and growing. By that point, it's becoming more mainstream. And then ATMs start popping up around the U.S. And at first we weren't sure. I mean, I actually doubted at first that the ATMs would be a popular avenue for the fraudsters to use, just because typically, we see a lot of the elderly are the ones who are being defrauded in the traditional brick and mortar MSBs, and I just didn't think that they would be technically. I mean, I thought the ATMs would be a little bit more too technically nuanced for them to navigate.
It would almost be a technical barrier that would keep them safe from fraud.
Right. But the fraudsters, are so good, and they found a way to pivot. And then, once you introduce QR codes, it makes it really easy. And then it makes sense for the fraudsters because, unlike your traditional brick and mortar store, there's no interperson, there's no interface, there's no react. They're not having any kind of a conversation with somebody behind the counter who's likely to stop them, if they suspect that they're being a victim of fraud.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I never thought of that. So that human control of the member of staff, seeing the elderly person, maybe who is not a crypto person, you can't ask those questions like, "No, what are you doing today?" "Oh, no, I'm doing something for my grandson's birthday." Well, that maybe explains why you're lodging some cash in to get a novelty thing, for example.
Yeah.
But I read online you'd mentioned on LinkedIn a particular instance. Was it someone lodging $75,000 or something, or $25,000 over a couple of
Oh, yeah.
days? You had mentioned a particular
Yeah.
case.
That's so, when we first started looking at, there was a crypto ATM right down the street from one of our offices. Um, and there is one of the law enforcement agencies had issued a subpoena for that ATM. And I said, "Hey, can you share that data with us? I'm really curious to see what it looks like, what different data points they actually collect at the ATM, and to see how we might be able to integrate that into our TRAC data, just to see what kind of, you know, um, connectivity there is, and how valuable it would be to law enforcement." So
This is taking the Western Union MSB style data and then looking at the patterns that's going on with those particular and those ATMs, I'm assuming, are just being ran from a corporate point of view. That's like a US company or a US LLC will own the lease for that ATM.
exactly what they all they do is they own the ATM, and they put it in a store, and they pay that store owner $400 to $500 a month to just.
Just like the old cash
Yeah,
ATMs.
exactly. And the store owner, oftentimes it's a liquor store or a smoke shop.
Mhm.
They know who their clientele is going to be, so they're strategic in where they put them. But that store owner has no oversight over that ATM. They're just collecting a few $100 a month, and
Is there any legal implications? I know there wouldn't be in the UK, but I don't want to make an assumption about the US. Is there ever any instances where, if there is no blatant and flagrant money laundering taking place, I'm not on about a scam for the avoidance of doubt. If someone's turning up, I remember a case in Australia where someone was going into a sort of an ATM where you could make
Mhm.
deposits, and they're literally turning up with, like, like the fly fishing jacket with just rolls of notes, just standing there. And like, each process was taking like 24 ATM, coming at like no midnight, 1 a.m., and just feeding in at like 11:58 and then 12:02 into the next day, feeding
Yeah.
in more. And I just imagine, is there a catch that if you're the liquor store owner and you're seeing this every day in the CCTV in your stores, like, you can see this happening, but I suppose they're not under any sort
Yeah,
of reporting
I'm
obligation?
not aware of any that have happened in the U.S., but
I wouldn't think so, but I just wanted to double check. There wasn't some, no, particularly at the southwest border, was there any sort of special
no,
powers or anything like that?
yeah, but I mean, I think we both know there's a bunch of willful blindness, taking place there.
Yeah,
They know when you see
of course.
the same person, repeatedly showing up, um,
Yeah.
and the person, doesn't look like you would expect them to be putting money into an ATM. Um, yeah, so
And as you said, without that human barrier, there isn't even a
right,
chance to just hear a plausible, like you can't be the good Samaritan and step in if you're, behind a screen in a liquor store. And I was in Australia before Christmas, and again, people that are advocates, and I think you and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you and I probably have the same view on crypto ATMs. It's not a bad position to take against the technology. It's just a realistic view on. I'm sure these things probably are abused more than they're
Oh
utilized
yeah,
on the ground. And like Australia was the same. I didn't come across a single ATM in a like snow fancy surrounding. It was in the back of a little corner
yeah,
shop. It was in the back of like a liquor store with no CCTV, or they were built with CCTV, but the CCTV was out of order. And it was little things like that.
yeah. So when we first got when that subpoena was first issued, this is like 2019 ish, and we got the returns. We also asked them to provide all of the photographs from the CCTV, so we can see any videos, any pictures. And there was a lot of, oftentimes there were like two people sitting there, like looked like one person was getting coached. A lot of the PII that was provided by the company, didn't line up. You'd get the same name, same telephone number, but a different DOB, or same name and date of birth, but a different telephone number. So it was very apparent that they were really falling short on their KYC, getting to know who their customers.
Because the people that defend the industry will say they collect KYC, and you're going, yeah, but if you collect it and don't ever challenge
Yeah.
it, then anyone can make up a name and a date of
Yeah.
birth.
So some of the companies we've spoken to, and and they're like, well, we collect ID at this certain dollar threshold, whether it be $250 or $500. And I'm like, okay. I said, well, how much do you think it costs to go buying stolen credit card information on the dark web? You can buy stolen credit card numbers for 10, 20 cents, like, or 10, $20. Like it doesn't cost you any.
Yeah, you can get a bounty for fifty
Yeah,
dollars.
exactly. Exactly. How much do you think it costs for, a human trafficker to go place an ad online in one of these websites for one of the girls that they're trafficking around? It's like $50. um, these CSAM sites around the country to watch these videos of these kids. It's $20 to $100 at most. So the the thresholds that we have in place for the traditional brick and mortars at $500 and above, we don't have that threshold for the ATM, because we know how much nefarious stuff is happening below that $500 threshold. So it's important to get a look at that. So that was kind of that was really like the genesis of us dipping our toe into the ATM world. Was we looked at it and we're like, oh wow, this would be really good. Um, so we subpoenaed, the Attorney General's office issued. Actually, it was Homeland Security. It was the first one. Department of Homeland Security here in the U.S. is the first one that issued subpoenas for us to a number of different ATM companies. And as you can imagine, a lot of these people that are running these ATM companies are very anti-government. Keep your nose out of my business. It's going against what crypto is supposed to be. We don't want anybody knowing who we are. But some of the companies did comply.
Said every money launderer
Yeah,
ever.
exactly, exactly. So some of the companies did comply, and we had, starting in 2019, we had data for 3 ATM companies, for every state in the U.S., and it was three of the top 10 biggest. So we had a lot of data. We had coverage for about 10,000 machines around the United States, which was really good.
What would you estimate? How many are there in total? 10,000 out of what? How
Um,
many ATMs do you think?
so, like I said, I think we had coverage for about, at the time, about 60%, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty good. It was really good. There were a couple companies that we really would have liked to have had, but they just simply would not comply. And, it was just a matter of whether or not, how hard the government wanted to push on them to get them to comply. And you're just prioritizing stuff, but uh,
You pick your
pick your
battles.
battles. So when we got all this, so now 2019, 2020, I think the average transaction amount at the time that we were seeing was right around like $750 or so. Um, but the activity, like if we looked at states in the southeastern part of the United States, like Florida and Georgia in particular, they were like they just those two states made up about just over 50% of all transactions in our database that were going to fraud shops. So it was a lot of carding activity. So it was, definitely buying stolen credit card data and all that other stuff off
Mhm.
the internet.
And again, for those that don't know, and for my own curiosity, I don't know a lot about Bitcoin ATMs. Are these all cash fed in to convert into Bitcoin to then use that as an onward transaction, or can you use debit cards or credit cards at the actual ATM
Yeah.
as well? How does
Some
that
of them
work?
are letting you do that now, but by and large, it's a person that walks up to the machine.
Mhm.
Um, typically they have a QR code, and 99% of the people are going up there and buying crypto as opposed to getting paid out. Um, so they're walking up, they have a QR code, which they hit the machine with, and they just deposit the cash. It oftentimes it'll ask them for a telephone number to send them a text message for two-factor authentication. Um, and then they put the cash in, and then they get their money after paying their fee, which is this was the thing that was like the really big eye opener to me was when I talked to some of the companies. I said, well, what are you guys charging them for a commission? And it was on the low end 7 to 8%. On the high end it was over 20. So
Bit more than an
yeah,
exchange.
right. So you know
Like why? Yeah, why would you do that?
makes
Like
no
why?
sense. And I don't
Yeah.
want to hear about it. It's convenient. You don't want to have to get on your computer. I said, well, you're still having to drive to a store.
Yeah, and if you're a crypto native
Right.
person, it seems counterintuitive that you're getting cash and then going and converting it into crypto to send it on.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you're working and earning cash, surely the payment rails are probably even harder than the country you're sending it back to. So if anything, they probably just appreciate Western Union cash as opposed to crypto on the other side. And like you said, that was put to bed anyway because you're saying that the data clearly showed that those transactions were traced through and actually they were going to the sort of fraud card
Right.
shops.
So we were seeing a ton go to fraud shops, to a much lesser extent, darknet. Um,
Mhm.
a lot of money going to African exchanges, CoinCola and
Yeah.
just the exchanges you see in Africa. Um, and the reason we know that is so at that time we had all of this ATM data and blockchain data. Um, so we partnered up with Chainalysis and started using their tool. So all of our every transaction, ATM transaction that we get at TRAC gets run through the Chainalysis API for attribution, and that
Okay. Nice.
attribution is placed in our portal. So if law enforcement goes in and into the TRAC portal and they got a Bitcoin address from a search warrant or off of somebody's phone or however they obtained it, and they can run it in TRAC to see if there's ever been any money placed on it at an ATM, and they'll get whoever that person was that deposited money into that wallet, and they'll get
Wow.
attribution. Um, so it's
That sounds phenomenal, and that's free for law enforcement to get access to that data, and it's now enriched data with the attribution from blockchain analytics as
Yeah,
well.
it is, and the other thing you can do is you can come into TRAC and you could say, if you're an investigator, say in California or Texas or wherever, um, you can say, all right, why don't you show me all transactions that are in TRAC, the crypto transactions, um, that show up as being related to a fraud shop or being related to gambling or high risk exchanges. Like we have a drop down menu. You can select whichever ones you want, hit run, and say, just give me those transactions for the past year. And what
Wow.
it is, what Aiden, what it is for me, in my opinion, like we're so busy at TRAC, we help with investigations. Like our analysts, or most everyone
Mhm.
is former law enforcement or prosecutor here. But we don't actually do the investigations ourselves. We're not cops anymore, so it's like we're leading a horse to water and trying to get them to drink it. But we're like, listen, there's a ton of really good investigative work or investigations that can come out of this information right here.
Yeah, it sort of seems to me with the new administration as well, and the whole no go to the borders sort of drive that there is at the minute, and obviously the clear the very clear rallying cry about tackling the sort of the narcotics issue as well. Is there a role, do you think, that there's going to be an eventual? I mean, it almost sounds like you could serve an intelligence function, and if you had more funding, actually having no a dozen investigators who were just proactively going through those opportunities, because that's traditionally the role I know of FIUs globally. We see this where we have a similar situation arising in a number of the countries that we support where they have traditional FIU, and now they've got 13 crypto exchanges have turned up on island, and they are just drinking from the fire hose in terms of what there used to be 100 suspicious transactions reports are now
Yeah.
5,000. And the 5,000 are complicated blockchain analytic related disclosures as well from exchanges. And if they just had the time and the tools, they could just probably be picking out these enormous disruption opportunities or international cooperation opportunities or just good old fashioned like pure seizures that could then be forfeited and reinvested into their programs. But everyone's now just swimming in almost not too much data, but certainly more data than they can actually act on. Like, what would you like to see with this? Necessarily not a political stance on the new administration, but like when a magic wand, what do you think? Is it a case of developing that investigative, or the opposite, more people knowing about track and coming to you guys to get the data?
So our data is, there's a couple things I'd have to say about that. Our data is, I think, is great. The one downside about our data is, and I may have mentioned this to you before, is it doesn't come in real time. So it's a little bit dated.
Okay.
So
Mhm.
if we get transactions that are a month old, as you know, in the crypto world, a lot of times
Yeah, could be
that
gone.
money's gone. But that's not always,
But it's still
it's still
evidence.
evidence.
It's still a
It's still
confirmation. Yeah.
evidence. And that's not to say that we couldn't have the data delivered a little bit faster than we do with the ATMs. Um, the biggest downside, that we see um, is the political will of smaller agencies here, state and local agencies here in the U.S. to do those investigations. I think the immediate response oftentimes is, well, the feds, that's something that the feds are going to have to do. Um, and they do it, and they do it well, but they only have so much bandwidth, right? So there's a lot of cases that just fall through the cracks just because there's no institutional knowledge at the state and local level to handle these investigations. I worked for the sixth biggest police department in the United States, and it's almost embarrassing to see what their knowledge is on investigative crypto.
So we had this very conversation in a webinar 2 weeks ago where we had Aaron West, Jonathan Scharf from Queens DA, and Alona Katz from
Yep.
Brooklyn, and that was literally the exact rallying cry. Like, you cannot rely on the feds to do
Yeah.
this, and that's not a criticism of the feds. It's there's take on limits and thresholds. They can't go after every
No.
case, and it's becoming so ubiquitous now. It's like saying we don't do internet related cases anymore. It's like you just have to start dealing with it. And we're working now with more and more task forces across the US because I think once people get over that knowledge barrier and do the first couple of cases, they realize it's just a new asset class, but actually it's the same patterns, same
It,
people, same criminal gangs, and they're just exploiting the next weakness, and it'll be something
yeah.
else in another 5 to 10
It's
years.
just a little bit more of a technical nuance to it, but it's still the same criminals, still the same scam artists, still money laundering, still fraud. Um, you look at. I was just recently looking at our data to see how like we're trending with our Southwest border data. Um, so we have coverage right now for about 1,700 machines. We had cover. I said we had coverage last year for 2024. We had coverage for 1,700 machines. This year we're at 1,500, which means some of these companies are closing the machines down, but activity isn't slowing down. Like if you look at our numbers, we're up. We're up about this year we're on track to surpass last year by about 37%. We're going to have 37% more transactions at less machines, and we're going to be up 57% by dollar volume that's being transacted at the machine.
57%.
Yes, and what's funny is, so again, as a reminder, we have Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California data. California implemented some laws about a year and a half ago or so. So the average transaction at a machine in California now is less than $500. It's like $425, $450 because they started capping transactions at $1,000. So a person can only transact $1,000 at a time. The problem is you'll see that same person doing 30 transactions in a month, for $1,000 at a time. They're going up every single day. So, but Arizona, the average transaction amount in a machine now in Arizona for this year is over $2,000. Texas is about 1,700. So they're
Yeah, and that's not your average low-paid worker sending
no.
money
Here's the
home
crazy part too.
at that
Here's the
amount.
crazy part about the whole thing. So I looked at. We have a widget within TRAC that will identify the top 20 transactors in any state. So I could say, give me the top 20 from Arizona over the past however many days. So I took the top 20 for Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas. So that's 4 states, 20 people. That's 80 people. There's only one person that's younger than 50 years old out of the 80 people. There's one person that's under the age of 50. The oldest was born in 1930. So that's going to put them at 95 years old. 85 years old. I'm sorry, 85. So no, 95 years old. 95 years old.
Yeah.
There were plenty born in the 30s, 40s. Those 80 people make up less than 0.5% of all of the people that have purchased crypto at these ATMs over the past year. They make up less than 0.5%, but they account for 10% of the cash volume that has moved through those ATMs in the past year. So
They're only depositing.
all they're doing is depositing. And in states like Arizona, you'll see them go or Texas or New Mexico has had some victims that have lost in the millions. They'll go up and put $15,000 in the machine at a time and, be done with it.
And it's sort of, there's so much to unpack. It's sort of mind-boggling because anytime that we speak on stage at crypto events, naturally people will always hold up the outlier cases, and people will give that. I'm all for everyone's right to privacy, but as someone that's been involved as a former sort of customs and criminal investigator and revenue and customs, we got to be involved in, going after tax offenses, kind of like IRSCI.
Right.
You'd have someone involved in child exploitation material, and they were getting paid, so you could catch them on a failure to declare this extra income, and it was a way, if you couldn't get them on the predicate offense, you'd at least try and get them jailed for tax offenses, or at least strip them of all their assets. So I'm naturally biased because for me, money laundering is not someone just a little bit of tax evasion. Or it's like you say, it's human trafficking. It is like it's the most sort of heinous of crimes. And anytime I try and argue about Bitcoin ATMs, I always get the same survivalist type that wants privacy. And I'm like, well, if he wants privacy, he's probably not using Bitcoin in the first instance on a global ledger. And even if there is that, there isn't this willingness, I don't think, in the industry to accept, as you say, that overwhelming data. So like I love the old Occam's razor. The most logical outcome to something is likely to be the most obvious one. So either you have a epidemic in your region of criminal gangs that have all decided in their twilight years to turn themselves into international money launderers. On their 94th birthday to say, hell, do you know what? I'm going to start money
Yeah.
laundering. Or either they're all victims of a crime. So as someone for the non-US folks, I understand that as a licensed MSB, for example, you have that extra layer of responsibility, that it's not just about putting in a suspicious activity report, it's looking at patterns. So if someone lodges $1,000 a day for 30 days in a row, do the Bitcoin ATM operators, do they have the same? Are they caught by the same regulatory
They are.
framework? I mean, are you seeing, I know that the data has to be submitted to TRAC, but are they preparing more like like intelligence disclosures, or is it just this is the transaction, you figure out the patterns?
You would think that there'd be more SARS filed, but there's not. And what I've seen is, like I said, in the early so from 2019 to 2022, there were other companies that whose data that we had in track, but they've since closed shop and gone out of business because, and they were legitimately trying to do things the right way. But they just said, Rich, they're like, we can't compete with these companies who don't care because they're making money hand over fist.
Yeah.
It's costing us too much money to try and do the right thing when there's companies out there that they know damn right well what they're doing, but they're making so much money off of it. So there's like
And again, that's the art. Yeah, that's the argument about the unit economics is that if there was enough people doing it purely legitimately, then there might be a market for it. But if the main use case is laundering and sort of evading the existing controls in the financial system, then that sort of tells the tale that legitimate people can't even operate in the system.
there are states that are trying to do things right now. Um, Connecticut, for example, just put a cap on um, the commission fee that companies can charge off of somebody. Um,
Oh, very good.
yeah, there's a couple other states that have bills out there. I don't know if they've gotten passed yet, um, where they're setting up a restitution fund for victims. So there's another state, was it Arizona or Connecticut? I think Connecticut actually was the one that did it, where um, it requires that the company has to offer a refund on the very first transaction that a person conducts if that person realizes they got scammed. Oftentimes that doesn't happen because the same people continue to get scammed over and over and over again. Um, but there is some
Yeah,
awareness to it, with different state.
but it's progress. It's something. Yeah.
It's something, um, but there's just millions and millions of dollars that of people's lifetime earnings is getting squandered by these scammers. And there's nothing, and it oftentimes it ends up in those exchanges that, in places that you would expect it to end up, right? That aren't necessarily friendly with law enforcement, but that just doesn't mean like people can pretend that it's not happening and doesn't exist and turn a blind eye to it. Um, it's pretty frustrating. We talk about it often, like
And
when we do our trainings, we talk about it and try and bring awareness to law enforcement, but we can't do the cases ourselves.
it is such a unique new problem because it's almost like the existing compliance regime has been built around a pretty like semi-solid foundation. There's enough component parts in place and enough safety rails, as you said earlier on. Just having like a teller in a bank and a cashier, there's a human interaction possibility there. Even knowing that to launder today in a world where there's no crypto assets or Bitcoin ATMs, I have to take my cash out of an existing regulated institution, for example. So again, there's another chance of catching it. I'm a customer of these entities. There's no awareness and education that they can do, and no normal like citizen is going to just go and wire money to a random foreign company
Mm-hmm.
in an average day-to-day transaction. I think what we're seeing now is because it's so effortless in the digital asset world. Whereas it is perfectly easy to get in your car, drive down to a little yellow box and send money to someone who's sitting in Nigeria right now. And we always, again, as an investigator, I remember like 15 years ago, the Western Unions, the MSBs, they were the really, complicated things to deal with. And it was like they're getting better and just making progress. And now it's like we're sort of not back to
Yeah.
square one, but it just feels like every time you cross a hill and go down, it's like, oh, there's a bigger one now. And this is the one that, like, what are your thoughts to start sort of to start rounding us out? Because I think you and I could talk about this for hours. I would love to. But what are your thoughts on with the new administration and a very clear pro crypto stance? Is this? I can imagine I could make the debate that this could go one of two ways. With greater adoption, there's going to be less regulation. A very clear, Deputy Attorney General saying, and like the Roman sterling off case, the Tornado Cash case, and no, not going after crypto companies for no not being licensed as MSBs. Is it a case of it could get worse, do you think? Or is it a case of actually because more legitimate US companies will now operate in this space, for those that are genuinely interested in using a crypto ATM, there might, and things like better legislation at state level to restrict fees and transaction fees, like you said. Is your outlook optimistic, if I can put you on the spot, or do you think
Yeah.
it's going to get worse?
Well, I think if there's greater adoption, there is greater awareness from a legislative level at the state level anyway. And if more legitimate companies come in and want to charge, you know, reasonable fees, then it might push out some of the bad actors who simply can't compete with the bigger the big corporate people that want to be involved in this space. Um, we were talking about, you mentioned the tornado mixer. He was found guilty, I believe yesterday. Was it
Yeah.
yesterday or the day before?
Yeah, just at the date of this recording, it was was it the some of the charges they got sort of hung on the money laundering charge, but I think he's been charged with operating an
Right.
MSB without a license.
That
But
was
then it does,
right. That was like, that's kind of an easy walk for him. That's like less than 5 years, if anything. The other two charges carried like 20-year terms, I believe. Uh,
and also what will happen with that Deputy Attorney General letter? That's like, well, we won't go after people. Is it a case of, well, that came out after your prosecution case started, so is he just missing out on that, or will that be reflected in sentencing? I don't know how the
yeah,
U.S. court system works.
we'll see. you know, I think there were some
Check back
people.
in a few weeks.
Yeah, some people didn't even want them to go after him.
Yeah. Oh no, it has, and obviously I get to see this as someone, an Irishman sitting in the UK looking at all of this, and you get to see that, and look, we're in a weird position as asset reality. I mean, our investors are split between like traditional, public sector, law enforcement, military, and like modern Web3 crypto, and I
Mhm.
hear both arguments, very, very like, heated debates about you absolutely cannot convict him for this, and others going, you should absolutely lock him up and set an example because there's it's one thing to develop something in MIT, leave the software on a shelf, someone picks it up. Like the creator of email should not be held accountable for
Mhm.
every scam email that's sent 20 years later. But there's an argument if you're at the wheel operating the front end and it's grown out of control. I always do the same thing. Like if you developed your own drugs in a basement and they went out of control and killed a bunch of people, would you be held accountable? And they're so unique cases. It's yeah, I wouldn't want to predict. I can see it going both ways.
Yeah.
I think I'm leaning more towards leniency. I also heard the other day that CZ has filed his application to start the process for getting pardoned. So I think
Yeah.
leniency might be the order of the day.
I struggle with, I'm all for, you know, your privacy and being able to do what you want to do, but I also have a hard time knowing if that there's, CSAM folks that are moving money through mixers and terrorists are moving money through. I have a hard problem with that. So
Oh, listen, and also that's the one thing as well. I mean, again, I don't want to be seen to be beating up crypto. I'm a big fan of the technology and the use
yeah,
cases,
sure.
but I want to hold individuals accountable. I want to
Yeah,
hold the exchanges that launder proceeds. Like
right.
virtually every large exchange in the US, some of them they jump up and down about having, we have all of these regulatory licenses. You're going, yeah, but you've also paid massive fines. You've like pled guilty and achieved settlements for like sanctions evasion. Like
Yeah.
not small things, and you're not, and it's like I think I saw one recently where they admitted there was a CSAM. They admitted it was stuff going to North Korea, and like they settled on that. And
Yeah.
you're like, and they're the big institutions that do have pretty robust, legal teams now. And
Hmm.
so yeah, for me, I just think that it isn't that cost of doing business argument. I think if you enter into this and your platform or your software is used and you don't take reasonable steps,
Sure. Yeah,
then I'm in your camp. I think there has to be that accountability. Otherwise,
for the
what deterrent
technology.
effect is it?
I'm all for the technology. I'm all for individual rights and privacy. But I think there comes a tipping point, and I don't know if we'll ever clearly define this, but there comes a tipping point where I think the investigative interests of the state or the country, from a national security perspective, are just are what's morally right and wrong. At some point, that's going to outweigh the benefit of, or somebody's individual privacy. That's just my personal feeling. But I am all for the technology. I think the technology applied the right way can be great.
It is. What do you think will be this the sort of magic wand question then, what do you think if we're chatting in a year or two time because of the the focus on narcotics enforcement, the focus on borders, do you think that this is actually good news in the sense of for the track as an organization? Do you think this will lead to more funding, better use, or do you think you'll still be on that sort of like if I'm an international investigator, it seems like you have a gold mine of data. Is that something can an international investigator, I'm sure, listening to this show will be going, I've got a case that has a nexus in
Yeah.
that part of the world. I mean, how does that sort of, sorry, two questions there, but no, but how will that work as well to make sure we hit on it? Someone who actually wants access to your data, law
Right.
enforcement only, of course.
Of course. So we couple things. We number one, I hope we always continue to get funding, and there are people that don't like track. The privacy rights activist groups out there. We're getting sued by one right now that doesn't like us. So there's always going to be that. As far as law enforcement goes, we often get that question because we have a lot of U.S. federal law enforcement that's stationed around the world.
Yeah.
So
Attaché network and things like that.
right, they're like, how can we share it? And I said, it can only be shared just like you'll share other U.S. law enforcement information. So, if there's like if you're having to go through, an MLAT or through, one of the other financial FIUs, how they exchange data, it can be done that way. But because we've had law enforcement in a number of different countries around the world reach out to us.
Yeah, it's because I think that's the big challenge that we're seeing is that there's a combination of overwhelming data and then not getting access to the right data. I suppose what do you think then is if you were asked to give an example of track as an organization like at its best, is there one case that sort of stands out where you guys have been involved and played your role, whether it's harm reduction, whether it's a big disruption case? Is there something that if especially if someone and I can imagine the types of listeners we have, people are always looking for initiatives in their countries and their jurisdictions where they can. And I love this sense. I'm going to dig into it after the show. The We always talk about good use of
Yeah.
forfeited assets and bringing in as part of the penalty, like basically making the criminal activity pay for this initiative.
Hmm.
And the settlement, I think, is a phenomenal playbook that I'm
Right.
sure the UK right now is looking at. What it does with its forfeited asset pot. Everyone's thinking about this now with their mutual evaluations as part of the FATF focus on asset recovery. And I know this sounds like an incredible initiative to not just take forfeited assets to fund law enforcement in the pure sense of like training and technology and software, actually setting up something like this. I know that I would love to see this in some of the jurisdictions that have massive
Yeah.
crypto footprints.
Like I said, we've had people reach out to us about it, and I said, really, our platform could be used anywhere in the world. It's just you have to be able to get the data. So TRAC isn't responsible for getting the data. If that jurisdiction can get the data, then TRAC is applicable. Really quickly, because I know you have to get going. I was in Africa helping out. I was teaching a class over in Africa, and they obviously have a huge human trafficking issue. I was in Nigeria with women getting sent up to Italy and Spain. And I said, give me a recent investigation that was done. And they gave us like 20 names that was involved in it was a big arrest that they had done up there, investigation. And they gave us the names, and we worked with some of our money service businesses here in the States. And it was the same MO. There was money being moved through the MSBs up to Sicily and up to Spain, and money coming back to Nigeria for all of those people involved. It's the same MO
Wow.
around the world. So it's just this model can be applied anywhere. What we're doing, it's just we just happen to have the data here in the U.S., but the technology can travel. It's not, it's not limited.
But it requires you needed that almost piece of legislation if it's framed as that
Yeah.
to
So
actually make them compel them to provide the data.
yeah, right. In some countries, as the
Mm.
GDPR obviously makes it extremely tough over there. But there's some other countries that, from what I'm told, have some similar programs. I was told Brazil has something similar. But I've had conversations with no less than 5 different countries about they're like, gosh, we want your technology, and I said it's not the technology. Like we could stand the program up for you, but you have to be able to get the data because the program
Yeah, if it's an empty shell,
it's an
I
empty
mean,
shell.
what you said, yeah.
Right. Right. But there's a lot of people that do have tons of data. Even here in the US, we tell law enforcement, like they get tons of data and it sits on an Excel spreadsheet and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to analyze it. So
And also, if you wouldn't mind, lastly, tell me about everyone that I've mentioned when I was saying I was talking to you today. Any law enforcement person over the last couple of weeks has said, "Oh yeah, those guys do an amazing training." Do you have an annual event, or is it a big event that you guys hold with IRSCI and a lot of federal authorities, like
Yeah,
hundreds and
so
hundreds of people?
we used to do an in-person conference every year in the Southwest border, but we do, because we're a nonprofit, we do trainings probably once a month.
Hmm.
Yeah, we recently did one with IRSCI that had, I don't know, about 600 people in it. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, we do routine trainings. Um, uh, and it's not always, we don't share actual data. So, but we can show how we analyze the data, if that, and the red flags that we look for. So it's some of the data some of the training that we put on can be applied to any law enforcement agency, because a lot of it's about the red flags that we see here. And we see a ton of it.
Connecting the dots.
We see a ton of it now. So there's so many complicit agent locations here in the U.S. that drug trafficking organizations in Mexico are now using store locations here in the U.S. to drop $100,000 off at a time and have them make up fake transactions. So that way they're not having to drive money across the country and into Mexico. It makes it so much easier to get a store on a payroll, give them a commission and make up transactions.
It's just such a coincidence you said that. I was involved at a roundtable discussion recently about the like what is the sort of government strategic priorities in asset recovery and sort of tackling illicit finance. And it is easy to go after the shiny new thing and to think everything has to be crypto related. And it was one of the sort of folks at this academic discussion that said, like, I think in the UK, for example, like trade based money laundering, because if we dedicate all our resources and just going after the new thing, like criminals will exploit the gap, and that gap will be, and if it's easier to just run through sort of the trades and just regular business, then that'll be the next thing, and that'll see a resurgence. And actually, the podcast guest sort of two before you that is about to will go up will go online in a few weeks was an investigative journalist for the Financial Times, Miles Johnson. And I would recommend to yourself and anybody else listening, we'll obviously listen to the podcast when it comes out, but he wrote a book, Chasing Shadows,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about that. It's one big story around a sort of a mafia boss in the south of Italy,
Mm-hmm.
and but it's using him as the central character and this DEA agent called Jack Kelly, and it sounds like a Dick Tracy. It sounds like a made-up name, and that's his actual name. Um, but what the book does is unpack the complexity of international money laundering and the interoperability of how a lot of these networks like support each other.
Oh,
And it's literally like it's like I gotta move stuff. And if I'm a criminal and I'm a cyber criminal in Russia and I'm a massive gang generating billions, it's like how do we physically move some things like cash for crypto? Well, let's speak to the cartels because they're really good at international shipping and logistics, and we'll
Mhm.
charge them a fee. And then who can maybe help with some of the laundering or some of the, well, we need to move some money around. Well, actually, if we use some of the gangs in Africa who've perfected, some of these cyber scam workshops and actually going through, because in Italy, because of the anti-mafia legislation, some of the actual like the testimonies and depositions, like the detail, and that's obviously him as an investigative journalist, he just spent a couple of years going through this and just seeing the scale of the testimony of just the interoperability that for them it's a big machine without a border.
Yeah,
And
I
I
was
think
gonna say,
that's what that hence the complexity for law enforcement tackling it.
yep, they pivot. Criminals can pivot a lot quicker than law enforcement can. They don't have the jurisdictional limitations with the borders that law
Yeah.
enforcement has.
What would you think is the magic wand then, Rich? You've got it's the same sort of question we finish out the podcast with as most people. With the experience that you've gathered in law enforcement and in this role right now, I mean, what is that? I think Tim Ferriss calls it. He uses the example in his podcast. If you could put anything on a billboard that everyone in our sector would see every single day for a year, like what would be the thing that frustrates you the most that you think can be fixed but isn't?
It's always for here. And we've gotten better with information sharing. Information sharing always seems to be the biggest anchor here in the U.S., particularly like with the federal law enforcement agencies. And there's it's that there was always a saying when I was in law enforcement, because I worked narcotics my entire career. Like, narcotics is a super competitive business, but not necessarily with the bad guys. Oftentimes it's with law enforcement themselves, like way too competing with one another. And then just like I said, I wish there was more uniformity around the world, and that's obviously it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen, but with sharing and enforcement of laws and enforcement of rules, and some countries just have a different perspective on things that they don't necessarily care about that we may hear in the U.S. and it doesn't make it right for us, but it does make it more difficult to get cooperation around the world. And like to your point, the criminals, they move money in the drop of a hat across 3, 4 different jurisdictions now, and it makes it that much more difficult for us.
Well, Rich, it is definitely one of the most interesting initiatives that I've heard of in terms of a penalty being turned into something so like ridiculously effective and important. And I'm sure it's something that we'll probably see others trying to replicate with the new FATF focus on asset recovery. And people need to do more effectively. And I'm sure more and more people will be reaching out to you to find out what this the blueprint is and see if they can help with some interesting legislation. I think we'll have to do a follow up. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really, really interesting, and I'm very, very grateful for you joining us today.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm happy that you can pass my contact information along to anybody. Happy to have conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Rich has shared some phenomenal statistics and insights on LinkedIn, so I'd recommend that. And if there is an annual report or any documents in the public domain with TRAC, we'll get them from Rich and we'll include them in the notes of the show.
Thank you, Aidan.
Thank you, sir.
Our podcasts are for informational purposes only. They are not intended to provide legal, tax, financial, and/or investment advice. Listeners must consult their own advisors before making any decisions on the topics being discussed.